Imagine waking up one morning and the sunlight feels wrong. Not faint, not dim for an hour, but a strange, cold gray covering the sky. You step outside and the world has lost its color. The grass, the trees, the streets, all under a pale, ghostly filter. Birds don't sing. Rivers look darker than usual. People stop in their tracks, squinting, trying to find the sun behind a veil that doesn't lift. You walk to your field and the earth is hard. Not from winter frost, but from months of gray skies, rainless days, and cold that seeps into your bones. You plant your seeds, but they struggle to sprout. You hear whispers from neighbors, the sun is gone. Will the crops survive? And in towns and villages across the lands, famine is quietly spreading. Families whisper prayers. Merchants fret. Soldiers wonder if their food stores will last. This was 536 AD. The sun dimmed across Europe, Byzantium, China. Scholars, peasants, and emperors alike were confronted with an unnatural winter in the middle of the year. What would normally be a warm summer for planting and harvesting turned cold, gray, unpredictable. Farmers watched their carefully tended fields fail. Livestock starved. Rivers froze earlier than ever. And the fear was everywhere. In the streets of Constantinople, bread lines grew long. People murmured, pointing at the sky, asking each other, "Have you seen the sun today?" And the sun, a weak, watery circle barely above the horizon, did little to calm them. Trade slowed. Caravans hesitated to cross mountains and deserts, unsure if the climate would ruin their precious goods. In the north, rivers that should have been bustling with commerce froze unpredictably. Villages far from imperial oversight felt abandoned. In China, the northern and southern dynasties watched crops with growing anxiety. Officials sent envoys to check grain stores. Fields failed. Farmers prayed, hoping for relief. Meanwhile, in the arid lands of the Middle East and North Africa, oasis communities and nomadic tribes faced scarcity on top of political instability. The world had always had challenges, but now nature itself seemed to be conspiring. People noticed the subtle signs first. Frost on the vineyards in early spring. Snow in places that hadn't seen it in decades. Rivers freezing when they should have run warm and clear. Disease found new opportunities. Weak crops led to malnutrition, and malnourished bodies were vulnerable. In Europe, plague spread along trade routes. In China, famine led to unrest, and local leaders scrambled to maintain order. Communities that had survived decades of war now faced a new, invisible enemy, the climate itself. For generations, people had understood disasters as moral or cosmic signals. A famine, a flood, a pestilence, these were signs from gods or the heavens. But in 536, the scale was so vast, so incomprehensible, that old explanations faltered. Kings, emperors, and local rulers had to confront the fact that even the strongest civilizations are vulnerable. And in that vulnerability, survival became a mix of resourcefulness, cooperation, and sheer stubbornness. The sky stayed gray. Day after day, the sun barely made it through the haze. People stepped outside and felt the chill even in what should have been warm months. Crops that usually fed families all year turned brown, shriveled, or failed completely. Fields that were once full of green shimmer now looked like dusty, dead carpets. Farmers scratched their heads. What happened? They whispered to each other. No one knew for sure. They had never seen a sun behave like this. Food started to vanish. Markets became strange places. Prices shot up for grains, bread, even basic vegetables. Families who had lived comfortably suddenly found themselves counting each loaf, each handful of lentils. Parents worried quietly at night, afraid their children would wake to empty plates. Communities that had shared freely before now hesitated, clutching what little they had. Some neighbors left their homes, wandering in search of anything edible. You could feel fear in the air, like frost creeping under doors. Even the great cities weren't safe. In Constantinople, streets smelled different. The air hung heavy with smoke and worry. People whispered about the emperor, wondering if the gods were angry. In faraway China, scribes wrote about autumn winds coming too early. Harvest festivals were smaller, quieter. The usual songs and dances were missing. People talked about bad omens, trying to make sense of what nature had thrown at them. It wasn't just food, it was a feeling, a deep unease. Families tried what they could. They stored whatever they had, stacked grain in new ways, dug deeper into their silos. Some experimented, planting hardier seeds, mixing crops, hoping for anything that could survive the cold, dim sunlight. Livestock became treasures as milk, eggs, and meat became precious. Villagers shared tips quietly: plant this, not that; water there, not here. Survival meant listening, learning fast, and sometimes just hoping. Through all this, life moved on. Children still played, though their laughter was softer. Parents still hugged, though their hearts were heavy. And somewhere in small corners of the world, monks and elders wrote down their observations. They recorded the strange sky, the cold summers, the famine, and the fear. They didn't understand the science behind it, but they understood one thing clearly: the world had shifted. The rules they had known didn't apply anymore. And in that quiet, shadowed world, people learned what it meant to endure. People looked for answers wherever they could. Some turned to priests, monks, and elders. They prayed, lit candles, and made offerings. They hoped for mercy, for the sun to shine again, for the earth to give them food. In cities like Rome and Constantinople, processions moved through the streets. People carried images of saints, asking for protection. In China, scholars debated the meaning in their scrolls, linking the dim sun to the rise and fall of dynasties, to the balance of heaven and earth. Trade slowed down. Caravans that usually moved goods across deserts and mountains now carried empty baskets. Merchants watched their profits shrink. Ships returned early, battered by storms and strange weather. Villages at crossroads waited for travelers with news, but fewer came. Roads that had once been busy with life grew quiet. Isolation became common. People shared rumors and stories, trying to make sense of the strange world around them. And yet, not everyone gave up. Communities adapted in clever ways. They dug new irrigation channels, repaired old wells, and spread risk by planting a variety of crops. Families leaned on each other more than ever. Extended relatives became lifelines. Food storage became a serious skill. Granaries were guarded, silos reinforced. What was once casual preparation became essential survival. Every loaf, every potato, every egg mattered. Small acts of cooperation made the difference between life and death. Plague added another layer of fear. The Justinian plague moved silently along trade routes, reaching towns already weakened by famine. People fled cities trying to escape invisible death. Doctors and healers did what they could, though knowledge was limited. Burial rituals changed, cemeteries filled faster, and grief became a constant companion. Fear and uncertainty shaped daily life, but it also shaped resilience. People learned to adjust, to protect what they could, and to carry on in the face of disaster. Through it all, the human spirit flickered. Children adapted to new routines, helping parents in fields and homes. Elders taught stories and songs to preserve memory. Faith, community, and small joys became anchors in a world that had lost its rhythm. The sky may have dimmed, crops may have failed, but life pressed forward. People survived not because the world became easy, but because they found ways to endure, ways to be resilient even when nothing made sense. Over time, the dim sun became a story whispered among villagers. Parents told their children about the gray skies and early frosts. Farmers remembered the years when the harvest barely fed them. Traders kept records of empty markets and late caravans. Even the powerful wrote about it in scrolls and letters, noting how empires bent under pressure. Yet from these hardships came quiet lessons. People learned patience, foresight, and community care. Storage, planning, and sharing weren't just ideas, they were lifelines. The fragility of life became clear, but so did the strength found in cooperation. Those who survived passed on these lessons to the next generation. Every tool, every stored grain, every act of help became part of a growing wisdom. The world slowly returned to color. The sun shone fully again. Crops grew, rivers flowed, and trade resumed. Cities buzzed, markets filled, and life regained rhythm. But people didn't forget the dim sun. It lingered in memory, shaping choices, communities, and governance. The experience created a subtle resilience, a preparedness for future shocks. And there's a quiet wonder in that. Even without understanding the science, people discovered how to endure. They adapted, they cooperated, and they survived. The sky eventually cleared, yet the memory stayed. It reminded them that life could be harsh, unpredictable, and fragile, and that humans could still carry on, even when the world seemed against them. The story of 536 is more than a tale of darkness. It's a lesson in endurance, a reminder that even advanced civilizations can falter, but also that resilience, built through community, preparation, and simple acts of care, can guide the world back to light. And maybe, just maybe, that lesson is one we need even today. Frosts lingered longer than anyone expected. Fields that should have been green turned brown and brittle. Farmers watched helplessly as young shoots withered under gray skies. Livestock struggled to find enough feed. Villages that had once been full of chatter grew quiet, anxious whispers filling empty streets. People realized slowly that this was no ordinary year. Markets began to fail. Grain that had traveled safely for centuries now rotted in storage. Traders canceled routes, fearful of loss. Prices for whatever food remained shot up. Families who had relied on neighbors to trade for what they could not grow found nothing available. Starvation spread quietly at first, creeping from house to house, village to village, leaving a shadow over daily life. People tried desperate solutions. Some dug deeper wells, hoping water might nourish struggling crops. Others rationed food strictly, sharing what little they had. Communities opened granaries for the neediest, but supplies ran out faster than anyone could plan. Children grew thin and pale, mothers fretted over feeding them, and fathers carried the weight of impossible choices. Even the strongest households struggled to survive. And yet, even in despair, humans adapted. Farmers experimented with new crops, ones that could endure frost or poor soil. Villagers started small food networks, trading eggs, dried meat, legumes, anything that might fill an empty stomach. Stories of clever survival spread, small innovations passed quietly between households. In these efforts, people discovered a grim truth. Survival was fragile but not impossible. Cooperation, creativity, and patience became as valuable as seed and soil. By mid-season, the famine wasn't just local, it stretched across regions. Fields in Byzantium, China, and parts of Europe all showed the same stubborn brown patches. Trade caravans slowed, some never reached their destinations. Word of empty granaries traveled faster than the food itself. Towns that once thrived now watched neighbors grow weak, sometimes vanish completely. Hunger changed people. Families who had argued over trivial matters now united, pooling every scrap. Communities became small survival networks. Older villagers shared knowledge about storing grains and preserving food. Younger ones learned fast, improvising tools and techniques to stretch rations. Desperation fueled ingenuity, though it came with bitter sacrifices. Disease followed hunger. Malnourished bodies weakened, making every cough or fever more dangerous. Plague spread along trade routes that hadn't stopped for famine. What began as crop failure quickly became a chain reaction. Food shortage, hunger, disease, and social strain. Every village, town, and city felt it differently, but the shadow of scarcity touched them all. Even with so much loss, humans didn't give up. Secret gardens sprouted in city corners. Small-scale irrigation helped some crops survive longer. Families rationed carefully, stretching every grain and leaf. And amidst the fear, small acts of generosity, sharing a loaf of bread, helping a neighbor, kept communities alive. The world was harsh, but people adapted. As the months dragged on, the famine began to reshape entire regions. Villages that once held laughter and daily routine started to empty. Some families packed what little they had and left, hoping to find better land somewhere else. Others stayed, too weak or too tied to their homes to move. Roads slowly filled with people searching for food, for work, for survival. Cities became crowded in strange ways. Not with prosperity, but with desperation. People gathered near granaries, temples, and any place where food might be distributed. Officials tried to manage supplies, but it was never enough. Lines grew longer. Tension grew sharper. Small disputes turned into fights. Hunger has a way of stripping patience away, leaving only raw survival instincts behind. At the same time, nature didn't offer relief. Seasons felt broken. Rain came at the wrong time or not at all. Cold winds returned when warmth was expected. Farmers who had adapted once now had to adapt again. It felt like chasing a moving target. Just when they thought they understood the pattern, it changed. That uncertainty became one of the hardest parts to endure. And still, life continued in quiet, stubborn ways. Some communities found balance. They rotated crops more carefully. They relied more on animals for food. They stored whatever they could, even in the smallest amounts. These were not perfect solutions, but they were enough to keep hope alive. In a world where everything felt uncertain, even a small harvest, even a shared meal, felt like a victory. And as this new world slowly took shape, something else was happening in the background. Systems were shifting, powers were changing, new ideas were rising. Because when the old world breaks, it makes space for something new. But before that new world could fully rise, the old one had to fade even more. The change wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, slow, almost invisible. Cities that once controlled trade, power, and wealth started losing their grip. Not because of one single event, but because everything had already been weakened. Famine had drained people. Disease had taken lives. And now, there just wasn't enough strength left to hold everything together the way it used to be. In many places, leadership started to feel distant. Governments couldn't respond the same way anymore. Resources were limited. Armies were smaller. Communication was slower. And people stopped expecting help from above. They started relying on themselves, their families, their small communities. Survival became local. And that changed the structure of society. Big systems slowly broke into smaller ones. Large cities lost importance, while smaller settlements became more stable in their own way. People moved closer to land, closer to food, closer to something they could control. It wasn't about growth anymore, it was about stability. At the same time, something deeper was happening inside people's minds. They started thinking differently. Not in big, ambitious ways like before, but in careful, realistic ways. They had seen what happens when everything goes wrong. So now, they prepared for it. They stored more. They trusted less. They adapted faster. And that's how resilience quietly grows. Not in comfort, but in struggle. Communities began to rebuild, but not the same way as before. They didn't try to recreate the old world exactly. Instead, they adjusted. Farming changed. Trade became simpler. Social systems became tighter. People created a new balance, one that could survive even if things went wrong again. And slowly, life returned. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Children were born into a different reality. One where stories of darkness and hunger were told like warnings. One where the past wasn't forgotten, it was remembered as a lesson. Because that's what this whole period became. A lesson. A reminder that even the strongest systems can fail. That nature doesn't follow human plans. That control is often an illusion. And yet, also a reminder of something else. That humans adapt. They break, but they rebuild. They lose, but they learn. They suffer, but they continue. And this is where the story of famine and struggle slowly comes to an end. Not because everything was fixed, but because people found a way to move forward anyway. And as they did, the stage was set for something even bigger. Because in the years ahead, new empires would rise. New beliefs would spread. And a completely different world would begin to take shape, built on the ashes of everything that came before. And as they did, the stage was set for something even bigger. Because in the years ahead, new empires would rise, new beliefs would spread. But before that future could fully arrive, something darker stepped in, something no one was ready for. At first, it didn't feel like a new disaster. It felt small, quiet. Not in comfort, but in struggle. Communities began to rebuild, but not the same way as before. They didn't try to recreate the old world exactly. Instead, they adjusted. Farming changed. Trade became simpler. Social systems became tighter. People created a new balance, one that could survive even if things went wrong again. And slowly, life returned. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Children were born into a different reality. One where stories of darkness and hunger were told like warnings. One where the past wasn't forgotten, it was remembered as a lesson. Because that's what this whole period became. A lesson. A reminder that even the strongest systems can fail. That nature doesn't follow human plans. That control is often an illusion. And yet, also a reminder of something else. That humans adapt. They break, but they rebuild. They lose, but they learn. They suffer, but they continue. And this is where the story of famine and struggle slowly comes to an end. Not because everything was fixed, but because people found a way to move forward anyway. And as they did, the stage was set for something even bigger. Because in the years ahead, new empires would rise. New beliefs would spread. And a completely different world would begin to take shape, built on the ashes of everything that came before. And as they did, the stage was set for something even bigger. Because in the years ahead, new empires would rise, new beliefs would spread. But before that future could fully arrive, something darker stepped in, something no one was ready for. At first, it didn't feel like a new disaster. It felt small, quiet. A few people getting sick, a strange fever, some pain in the body. Nothing that seemed out of control. But this time, it moved differently. Faster, deeper. And people didn't understand what they were facing. The bodies were already weak. Hunger had done its damage. Years of poor harvest had drained strength from people. So when this sickness arrived, there was nothing left to fight it. A healthy body can resist, but a starving one, it breaks quickly. And that's exactly what started happening. People would go to sleep feeling normal, and wake up burning with fever. Their bodies shaking, their energy gone. And then, those painful swellings appeared. Under the arms, around the neck. Dark, swollen lumps that made even breathing feel heavy. Fear spread fast, because this was something new. Families tried to help. They stayed close. They cared. But the sickness didn't stop. It moved from one person to another, silently. A house would fall sick, then the next, then the entire street. And slowly people began to realize this wasn't just illness. This was death spreading. Trade routes made it worse. The same roads that once carried food during famine, now carried disease. Ships arrived in ports, bringing more than grain. Caravans crossed cities, spreading something invisible. Every connection between places became a pathway for this sickness. Cities turned into danger zones. Too many people. Too close together. No way to escape. What once gave life, now took it away. And the numbers, they kept rising. More deaths. More fear. More silence. It felt like the world was being emptied, piece by piece. And still, no one knew why. Some said it was punishment. Some said it was fate. Some believed the world was ending. Because after everything people had already faced, this felt like the final blow. First hunger, now death itself walking through the streets. And in that moment, one truth became clear. Nature wasn't done yet. And in that moment, one truth became clear. Nature wasn't done yet. Because what came next wasn't just about sickness. It was about power falling apart. The systems people trusted, the empires they believed were strong, they started to shake. Not suddenly, not in one loud collapse, but slowly, quietly, like something breaking from the inside. In places like Byzantium, the heart of what was left of the Roman world, things were no longer stable. Leaders were still there. Armies still existed. But everything felt stretched. Too many problems at once. Too many losses. Too little control. The government tried to manage it all, but reality was slipping out of their hands. Taxes became harder to collect. Not because people didn't want to pay, but because they simply couldn't. Farms had failed. Workers had died. Trade had slowed down. And without resources, even powerful empires start to weaken. At the same time, armies were no longer as strong as before. Fewer soldiers, less support, more pressure. Borders that once felt secure, now felt open, vulnerable. And enemies could sense it, because when a giant starts to weaken, others start watching. And it wasn't just one empire facing this. Far away in China, the situation looked different, but felt the same. The land was already divided between northern and southern dynasties. Power wasn't united. Leadership wasn't stable. And now, with climate pressure and food shortages added to the mix, things became even more fragile. Rulers struggled to keep control. Local leaders gained more power. Conflicts increased. And people caught in the middle, they just tried to survive. Because when leadership is unstable, the common person always feels it the most. And slowly, something deeper started happening. Trust in big systems began to fade. People stopped believing that empires could fully protect them. Because they had seen too much failure, too much loss, too many promises that couldn't be kept. And when trust breaks, the entire structure changes. Instead of relying on distant rulers, people turned toward local power. Small communities, local leaders, family networks. Survival became closer to home. More personal, more direct. Empires didn't disappear overnight, but they became fragmented. Pieces of something that once felt whole. Still standing, but not the same. And in this broken structure, new forces quietly started rising. Groups that were once small, now found space to grow. Regions that were once controlled, now had room to change. Because when power weakens, it creates gaps. And history shows, those gaps never stay empty for long. This wasn't just chaos, it was transition. An old world losing its grip, and a new one slowly forming underneath. And the people living through it, they didn't see it as history. They felt it as uncertainty, as instability, as a world that no longer followed the rules they once knew. And yet, even in this chaos, movement continued. Because when everything breaks apart, that's when history starts rebuilding itself, in a completely different shape. And yet, even in this chaos, movement continued. Because when everything breaks apart, that's when history starts rebuilding itself, in a completely different shape. But this rebuilding didn't start with kings or empires. It didn't begin in palaces or battlefields. It started quietly, between people. Between families, neighbors, and small groups who had no choice but to rely on each other. Because when the big systems fail, the small ones become everything. Families became stronger units than ever before. Not just emotionally, but practically. People depended on their relatives for food, shelter, and protection. A brother would share his last grain. A mother would stretch meals just to keep everyone alive. Survival was no longer an individual fight. It became a shared responsibility. If one person failed, the whole group suffered. So they held on to each other, tighter than ever. Neighbors too started playing a bigger role. In normal times, they were just people living nearby. But now, they became lifelines. One family might have a little extra food. Another might have tools. Someone else had strength to work the land. Slowly, these small exchanges turned into survival systems. Not perfect, not always fair, but enough to keep people going. Trust, however, became a complicated thing. People wanted to help, but fear was still there. Fear of disease, fear of scarcity, fear of betrayal. So relationships became more careful, more intentional. People chose who to trust, who to depend on. And those bonds, once formed, became incredibly strong. In many places, religious centers like monasteries became safe zones. Not just for prayer, but for survival. They stored food. They offered shelter. They organized help. Monks and religious leaders stepped into roles that went beyond faith. They became organizers, caretakers, and sometimes even leaders of entire communities. These places created a sense of order in a world that felt broken. People would travel long distances just to reach them. Not because they had everything, but because they had something. And in times like these, even a little hope is enough to keep moving. Charity slowly turned into a system, not just an act. Helping others wasn't random anymore. It became expected. A duty. Because people had learned one simple truth: no one survives alone. And this idea started shaping society in deeper ways. Even laws began to reflect this change. Rules about family, inheritance, and responsibility became more detailed. Not for control, but for stability. To make sure people knew their roles. To make sure support systems stayed strong. Because without structure, everything could fall apart again. Communities also started adapting how they worked. Tasks were shared. Responsibilities divided. Some focused on farming. Others on protection. Others on gathering or storing food. It wasn't organized like a modern system, but it worked. Because it was built on necessity. And slowly, something powerful started forming. A different kind of strength. Not the strength of armies or empires, but the strength of connection. Of people choosing to stand together, even when everything around them was falling apart. This wasn't the world they once knew. It was smaller, slower, harder. But in some ways, it was stronger. Because it was built on real needs, real relationships, real survival. And over time, these small networks became the foundation of something bigger. Because when enough small systems hold together, they start shaping a new world. A world where survival is shared, where trust is earned, where community becomes the real power. And from these quiet connections, a new society was beginning to rise. And as communities learned to rely on each other, they also began to rethink the way they worked the land. The old ways had failed when famine hit, so people had no choice but to experiment. They planted new crops, mixed varieties, and tried techniques that older generations had ignored. Terraces were built along hillsides to prevent soil erosion, and small irrigation channels redirected water from rivers and streams to fields that had once gone dry. Every experiment was a gamble, but with every gamble came knowledge and survival. People started to notice patterns. Certain crops resisted the harsh conditions better than others. Wheat might struggle, but barley survived. Legumes returned nutrients to the soil while feeding families. Slowly, farmers learned to combine crops in ways that protected the land and the harvest. Fields became patchworks of green and gold, not just for beauty but for resilience. Every row, every seed was a lesson learned from years of hardship. Storage became just as critical as planting. Granaries were reinforced, underground pits were dug to keep crops cool, and techniques to prevent spoilage were passed from neighbor to neighbor. Families shared tips. Cover seeds with ash, rotate stock, store the most vulnerable crops at the center of the pile. Innovation was no longer a luxury, it was survival. The ingenuity of people turned scarcity into strategy. Even those living far from centers of power adapted quickly. Small villages pooled resources, experimented with new tools, and created informal councils to share successes and failures. It wasn't science as we know it today, but it was science in its rawest form. Observation, trial, and careful documentation in the memory and experience of the community. Every season was a classroom, every harvest a report card. The innovation didn't stop with planting and storing. People began designing systems that could withstand the next disaster. Water channels were lined with stone. Terraces were reinforced with timber. They planted cover crops to keep soil fertile and rotated fields to prevent exhaustion. Knowledge that might have been lost in times of peace was now recorded in practice, embedded into everyday life. Children grew up learning these methods as naturally as walking. And slowly, the lessons of this period spread. Neighboring communities watched, learned, and copied successful techniques. Trade of seeds, tools, and know-how became just as important as trade of food itself. What began as a necessity evolved into a culture of agricultural ingenuity. People were no longer just survivors. They were inventors, problem solvers, and strategists. Through these innovations, humanity found a way to reclaim stability. Crops that once failed began to thrive. Families could plan for the future instead of living day to day. Communities became more resilient. And with each new harvest, the memory of famine and despair slowly transformed into stories of adaptation, skill, and hope. The shadow of the dim sun had taught humanity a harsh lesson, but it had also sparked creativity, experimentation, and resilience that would carry generations forward. Where once there was desperation, now there was possibility. Where once the fields had been fragile, they now held the promise of abundance. As communities adjusted to survive on the land, their minds also turned to understanding the disasters that had upended their lives. Why had the sun dimmed? Why had famine and disease swept through so quickly? People looked to the heavens, seeking answers beyond the soil and crops. Religious leaders offered explanations. Some claimed it was divine punishment, others interpreted it as a test of faith. Temples, churches, and monasteries became places not just of worship, but of discussion, debate, and reflection. Faith offered structure to chaos, a way to interpret what otherwise seemed senseless. Families and villages gathered in prayer and ritual, hoping that their devotion could sway the powers that had brought hardship. Stories of saints, divine interventions, and miraculous recoveries spread from village to village, giving hope to those who had lost almost everything. Art and music, often inspired by these interpretations, flourished even amid scarcity. Hymns were sung, manuscripts were illuminated, and symbols carved in wood and stone depicted survival, devotion, and the lessons of suffering. Yet, religion was not just solace, it shaped decisions. People restructured their communities to reflect moral and spiritual guidance, building spaces for shared support, charity, and education. Monasteries doubled as granaries, hospitals, and centers of knowledge. The spiritual and practical intertwined. Faith became a framework through which communities understood the disasters and found meaning in their struggles. At the same time, this period reshaped culture itself. Literature, art, and oral traditions began to reflect the new reality. Tales of famine, plague, and resilience were woven with lessons of morality and the divine. People learned to interpret every natural event through a dual lens of survival and spirituality. The past tragedies were no longer mere hardships. They were stories with moral, cultural, and theological significance. Through these interpretations, humanity found a sense of control amid uncontrollable forces. Communities could endure because they believed there was meaning behind the suffering, a narrative that extended beyond themselves. Religion and culture didn't just explain the world, they guided it, offering paths to adapt, survive, and even thrive when nature's fury struck again. In the shadow of disasters, faith became both a refuge and a roadmap, turning fear into resilience, despair into reflection, and chaos into stories that would last for generations. Despite all the political rearrangements and societal adaptations, one lesson stood out above all. Nature always had the final word. No matter how advanced or organized a civilization was, a harsh winter, a dimmed sun, or a raging plague could topple even the mightiest empires. Humanity had built walls, armies, and trade networks, but these defenses often proved fragile when faced with the sheer unpredictability of nature. Across Europe and Asia, people witnessed firsthand how crops failed, rivers flooded, and disease spread without warning. Even rulers who considered themselves wise and powerful found their plans undone. Humility became a quiet, essential teacher, reminding societies that control over the environment was always limited. Empires learned that arrogance could be deadly, and that respect for natural forces was not optional, it was survival. Communities began to internalize this lesson in subtle but profound ways. Local knowledge, traditional practices, and careful observation of the environment gained value. Monasteries recorded weather patterns, farmers experimented with different planting methods, and rulers started to consult advisors who understood the land and climate. Each adaptation was a small acknowledgement that humans were not the masters of the world. They were participants in a much larger system. The disasters of 536 AD and the years that followed left an enduring legacy. Even when society advanced, technology improved, and governance became sophisticated, the world's fragility remained evident. Humanity's greatest strength turned out to be the ability to learn, adapt, and remain humble in the face of forces far greater than themselves. This humility wasn't a weakness, it was a survival mechanism, ensuring that civilizations could rise again even after being humbled by nature. Ultimately, the dim sun, the famine, and the plague were not just historical events, they were powerful reminders. They taught generations that no empire, no matter how advanced, could ever escape the laws of nature. True progress, it seemed, required a balance between ambition and respect, between human ingenuity and the ever-present power of the natural world. Even as civilizations learned humility, nature had more lessons waiting in the wings. Scientists today look back at the dim sun and famines of the 6th century and see hints of something far more dramatic: the potential of supervolcanoes. These massive underground forces can erupt without warning, spewing ash high into the atmosphere, dimming the sun, and causing global cooling. The disasters of the past serve as a chilling reminder that even in modern times, humanity is not immune. Mega eruptions are rare, yes, but their impact would be catastrophic. Entire regions could see crop failures, water shortages, and climate disruption. The lessons from 536 AD echo loudly here. Planning and resilience are not optional. Cities, governments, and communities must consider these deep threats, even if they seem unlikely, because history has shown that rare events can reshape the world in ways no one expects. The knowledge of supervolcano potential has inspired scientists and policymakers to invest in monitoring systems, early warning networks, and disaster preparedness plans. Unlike the people of the 6th century who faced the unknown with fear and confusion, modern societies have tools to anticipate and respond. Still, the scale of such a threat reminds us that human ingenuity is powerful, but not absolute. Nature's forces remain beyond full control. Reflecting on these possibilities, it becomes clear that understanding history isn't just academic, it's survival. The struggles of past civilizations teach us how to build more resilient communities, diversify food sources, and respect the delicate balance between human progress and natural forces. Each lesson reinforces the idea that while humans can adapt and innovate, humility before nature is timeless wisdom. Ultimately, the story of the dim sun, famine, and plague is not just about the past. It is a warning, a guide, and a call to action. Supervolcanoes, climate change, and unforeseen disasters remind us that preparation, awareness, and respect for the environment are essential for any society that hopes to thrive in an uncertain world. The past whispers lessons that remain as urgent today as they were over 1,000 years ago. History, it seems, never truly forgets its lessons. A few centuries after the dim sun of 536, nature reminded humanity again. In 1815, Mount Tambora erupted in Indonesia with a ferocity that shocked the world. The eruption was so massive that it led to the year without a summer. Crops failed across Europe and North America. Temperatures dropped, and unexpected frosts destroyed fields that had once promised bounty. People who had never thought twice about the whims of nature suddenly found themselves struggling to survive. The social impact was profound. Food shortages sparked unrest. Riots broke out in towns, and entire communities were forced to adapt or perish. Farmers, merchants, and families scrambled to find solutions. The echoes of past calamities were unmistakable. Famine, disease, and political stress followed in Tambora's wake, a stark reminder that nature's power is relentless. Even in an age of growing industrial knowledge, humanity was humbled. But there were lessons in adaptation. Communities that relied on diversified crops or strong local networks fared better than those dependent on single harvests. People innovated quickly, trading goods over longer distances and finding alternative food sources. Monasteries, towns, and families became vital lifelines for survival, echoing the social strategies of centuries earlier. The past and present intertwined, showing that even the most modern societies could learn from ancient resilience. Tambora also highlighted the global reach of natural disasters. Unlike the regional events of 536, the eruption's effects spanned continents, affecting climate and economies far from Indonesia. This reminded leaders, scientists, and citizens that preparation must be both local and global. No community exists in isolation when facing the immense power of nature. In reflecting on Tambora, it becomes clear that history is a teacher that refuses to be ignored. From the dim sun of the 6th century to the volcanic winter of 1815, the message is consistent. Humans can adapt, innovate, and survive, but only if they learn from the past, respect the environment, and build resilient systems capable of weathering nature's fiercest trials. Fast forward to today, and the stakes are higher than ever. The world is more connected than in any past century. A failure in one region doesn't stay local. It ripples across continents in hours, not years. A drought in South America can affect food prices in Africa, Europe, and Asia. Supply chains, once slow and regional, now transmit both goods and shocks at lightning speed. Humanity is more interlinked, but that also means we share vulnerabilities. Modern agriculture, despite technology and science, is not immune. Monocultures, reliance on global trade, and climate change make crops fragile. A pest outbreak or heat wave in one area can cascade, affecting millions who never even saw the original disaster. Just like in 536 or 1815, people struggled to adapt, but now the scale is global and the pressure immense. It's a reminder that advanced civilizations are only as resilient as their systems allow. Communities, governments, and scientists work hard to prepare. Early warning systems, international aid networks, and food reserves aim to prevent a single failure from triggering widespread panic. Yet, the lesson is the same as centuries ago. Nature doesn't negotiate. It doesn't care about borders, economies, or technology. Preparedness, humility, and cooperation remain crucial. This interconnectedness also teaches something vital about responsibility. Our actions in one corner of the globe, whether deforestation, emissions, or overuse of resources, can exacerbate vulnerability everywhere. Modern society must recognize that resilience is a shared duty. What happens in one field or river basin can cascade across the planet, just as the dim sun or Tambora eruption affected millions beyond their immediate surroundings. As we reflect on history from 536 to 1815 to today, the message is clear. Nature is a force that spares no one, yet humans have the capacity to learn, adapt, and innovate. Our interconnected world makes us vulnerable, but it also gives us unprecedented tools for preparation. It's a call to action, a reminder that humility, foresight, and collective effort are the keys to survival in the face of forces far beyond our control. Even with the lessons of history, humans have found ways to fight back against the unpredictability of nature. In the modern era, science and technology have become our most powerful allies. Satellites orbit the Earth, scanning for unusual heat patterns, smoke plumes, or ash clouds that signal volcanic activity. Seismographs, placed in every corner of high-risk zones, monitor tremors that might indicate an impending eruption. Every flicker, every anomaly is recorded, analyzed, and interpreted by scientists working day and night. They don't just observe, They predict, they estimate, and they prepare. The importance of early warning systems cannot be overstated. Imagine a massive eruption somewhere in the Pacific Ring of Fire. Without warning, millions would be caught unprepared, roads blocked by lava, ash clouds darkening the sky, and food supplies disrupted. Today, however, networks of sensors, satellites, and computer models can give cities, countries, and even continents days or weeks to brace for the worst. Governments coordinate evacuation plans, hospitals stock supplies, and humanitarian organizations prepare to deliver aid the moment disaster strikes. Science transforms potential catastrophe into managed risk. It's not just technology, though, it's the meticulous human effort behind it. Teams of volcanologists analyze data in real time, comparing past eruptions, studying soil chemistry, gas emissions, and thermal readings. They simulate scenarios: how far lava might flow, where ash might fall, which communities would be most affected. Each prediction is a lifeline, a chance to reduce casualties, to protect livelihoods, to maintain order when chaos threatens. The knowledge of nature's power is terrifying, but preparation tempers that fear with action. Moreover, these early warning systems extend beyond volcanoes. Climate monitoring, flood alerts, and crop forecasting all play a role in reducing vulnerability. A single warning about a failing harvest or an incoming storm can save thousands of lives. Technology turns uncertainty into foresight, but it also requires trust. Communities must act on these warnings, and governments must ensure the infrastructure is in place to respond effectively. The chain of preparedness, from observation to action, defines whether disaster becomes tragedy or a managed event. History has shown repeatedly that humans cannot stop nature, but we can learn to respect it, anticipate it, and mitigate its effects. From the dim sun of 536 to Tambora in 1815, the lessons are consistent. Vulnerability is universal, but preparedness makes a difference. Science does more than predict eruptions. It teaches humility, cooperation, and responsibility. The world is more connected now than ever, and these early warning systems are proof that knowledge, applied correctly, can save lives across continents. In the end, preparedness is as much about mindset as it is about technology. It's about accepting that nature is beyond control but not beyond understanding. Every sensor, every model, every alert is a bridge between history's harsh lessons and a safer, more resilient future. Humanity has survived plagues, famine, and eruptions because people cared enough to watch, to measure, and to act. Today, science gives us tools that our ancestors could only dream of, but the principle remains the same. Vigilance, planning, and respect for nature's immense power are the keys to survival. Even with all our satellites, sensors, and predictive models, humanity is not invincible. Technology gives us an edge, but it cannot erase the raw power of nature. A supervolcano, a mega eruption, or multi-year cooling events could still overwhelm modern systems. Think about it. A single volcanic eruption could block sunlight for months, dropping temperatures worldwide. Crops fail, livestock struggle, and global supply chains grind to a halt. Even the most advanced nations would feel the shockwaves. Preparedness can delay disaster, but it cannot entirely prevent the cascading effects of nature's wrath. The interconnectedness of the modern world is a double-edged sword. On one hand, early warnings can be shared instantly across continents. On the other hand, disruptions ripple faster and wider than ever before. Food shortages in one region affect markets across oceans. A cooling period or famine can trigger migration, social unrest, and economic strain far from the initial epicenter. Technology is powerful, but the scale of a global crisis can still overwhelm our resilience. The lessons of 536 AD or Tambora are not just historical curiosities. They are warnings that even our advanced civilization remains fundamentally vulnerable. Moreover, technology relies on human systems that are fallible. Power grids can fail, communication lines can be severed, and emergency logistics can be delayed. Science can forecast, but it cannot enforce action. Communities must respond correctly, governments must coordinate effectively, and individuals must trust the warnings they receive. Any break in this chain can magnify the disaster. The cold, hard truth is that human vulnerability has shifted from ignorance to dependence. We now rely on complex systems that, while powerful, can also fail spectacularly when stretched to their limits. Climate and volcanic events are slow-moving threats, but their consequences are persistent. A few months of reduced sunlight can create cascading effects that last years: crop losses, water shortages, malnutrition, economic crises. Even our most sophisticated modeling cannot guarantee complete protection. History reminds us that resilience is not absolute. It is a race against nature, and sometimes we are forced to confront our limits. Lessons from past catastrophes echo in today's world, urging humility and caution. Ultimately, modern resilience is impressive, but it is not invulnerable. We have learned to anticipate, mitigate, and respond, but nature remains a force beyond control. Multi-year cooling, extreme weather, or massive volcanic eruptions could still disrupt our lives on a global scale. Technology buys us time, but it cannot erase our dependence on a stable environment. Respect for nature, careful planning, and global cooperation are still the keys to survival. In the end, the ancient world's vulnerabilities and modern civilization's strengths coexist, reminding us that no amount of progress can make us entirely immune. As we look back on the trials of history, one thing becomes crystal clear: humans are survivors. Through famines, plagues, and political chaos, communities found ways to adapt, support one another, and rebuild. From the dim sun of 536 AD to the Tambora eruption of 1815, people learned that resilience isn't just about surviving. It's about understanding, adjusting, and preparing for the next challenge. Even when empires fell and societies fractured, the human spirit found a way to endure. Modern society stands on the shoulders of these lessons. Our technology, global trade, and scientific knowledge give us tools previous civilizations could only dream of. Yet the past reminds us that tools alone are not enough. We must combine them with awareness, humility, and cooperation. Nature's power hasn't changed. Our approach to it must evolve. When crops fail, economies tremble, or climates shift unexpectedly, history whispers a warning: respect the forces beyond our control. At the heart of it all is adaptation. Communities, whether ancient kin networks or modern urban societies, survive by staying flexible and connected. Monasteries, neighbors, and trade networks once formed lifelines. Today we have international aid, communication networks, and early warning systems. The principle remains the same: humans survive best when they work together and learn from the past. Every lesson from history strengthens our ability to face the unpredictable. Finally, humility is the thread that ties all these experiences together. No matter how advanced we become, nature will always have surprises in store. Our greatest civilizations are still vulnerable to the unexpected, a reminder to respect, prepare, and continuously adapt. The stories of the past are more than chronicles of hardship. They are guides for building a future that balances progress with caution. By carrying forward these lessons of resilience, adaptation, and humility, modern society can navigate the uncertainties of the natural world. We can innovate, prepare, and respond, but never forget that our strength lies in learning from those who endured before us. History is both a mirror and a map, a reflection of human vulnerability and a guide toward a wiser, more prepared future.